In early 2026, the internet is consumed. The full Epstein files are released. YouTubers on jet skis race to Little St. James, racking up over 52 million views. On shore, a viral clip forces a man in Florida to stand before the world and declare, "I'm not Jeffrey Epstein, I'm Palm Beach Pete." A global media storm. But this spectacle, all this noise, is a surface current, designed to hold your attention. The real crime, the one that engineered the very system we now live in, didn't happen on an island in the Caribbean. It began on a different island entirely. A quiet, fog-covered place off the coast of Georgia. And it began over a century ago, in the year 1910. The year is 1910, November 22nd. A private train car sits waiting at a quiet New Jersey station, its windows drawn tight. One by one, under the cloak of twilight, a handful of men board. They carry shotguns and wear the gear of duck hunters. But they are not hunters. In this single car, the Rockefeller Empire and the House of Morgan sit shoulder to shoulder. The most powerful private financiers on Earth share one narrow aisle. And they are slipping out of the city in disguise, like fugitives. The air inside the car is thick, smelling of very expensive cigar smoke. Glasses clink softly, a fragile sound against the growing rumble of the wheels. The velvet deets absorb all noise, creating a closed, pressurized chamber, like a steel hull lowered away from the surface. They are heading south, into the dark, and they are terrified. Not of the dark outside, but of the light. Exposure means total ruin, political, financial. Their mission is to quietly design a new central banking system for America. In a country already suspicious of concentrated money power, even whispering about that in public is poison. Their political shepherd, Senator Nelson Aldrich, sets a non-negotiable rule. For the entire duration of the journey, for the whole of the meeting, no one is to use last names. To the servants, they are simply Frank, Paul, Harry. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, feels the rule like a physical weight. He hears his own surname as it would sound in a headline, stacked beside Secret Meeting and Wall Street. He imagines depositors reading it at breakfast, senators brandishing it in hearings. His chest tightens. One careless syllable, and this car becomes a torpedoed vessel, pulling every career inside it down. He catches another man, one of the world's premier bankers, beginning to say his name in a moment of conversational habit. The man doesn't get the first syllable out. A cold, silent glance from Senator Aldrich across the car cuts him off. Glasses pause halfway to lips, breath stalls. Eyes drop to the floor or to the passing blur beyond the window. In that suspended second, Vanderlip can feel the entire scheme hanging by a thread, as thin as a spoken consonant. The silence that follows is heavier than any spoken warning. Whenever a servant steps in to refill a glass or clear an ashtray, the conversation pivots instantly. One moment, they are deep in the mechanics of controlling the nation's money supply. Vanderlip leans in. If we can channel the reserves through one central, the door handle clicks. A white-jacketed porter slips inside. Vanderlip's tongue hits the brakes. Marsh. The marshes should be full of birds this time of year, he says instead, too quickly. A couple of men nod with exaggerated interest. Someone laughs a beat too late about the flight of ducks. The porter hears nothing but talk of weather and waterfowl, gathers the glasses, and withdraws. As the door closes and the servant's footsteps fade down the corridor, the real conversation dives back below the surface. So there they are, the architects of the coming century, huddled in a sealed car that feels less like a railway carriage and more like a pressure capsule slipping down a dark channel. They sit in borrowed hunting coats, pretending to be something they are not, performing the same careful signals over and over, just to reach an island off the coast. From where we watch, peering in through this little window in time, the question rises through the murky currents of cigar smoke and fear. What exactly are they planning to build there that requires it to be born in total darkness? The thing they planned to build in total darkness required a special kind of forge, a place outside of the world. The train journey ended where the continent did. From the coast of Georgia, a small ferry carried the hunters across the Sound. Cold wind came in low over the marsh, combing the grass flat, carrying the dull slap of water against pilings. Their destination was a shadow on the horizon that slowly resolved into a private kingdom, Jekyll Island. Officially, it was a club. In practice, it was a winter fortress for men like J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller. In the off-season cold of late November, the verandas were empty, shutters closed, the surrounding miles of marsh and gray water forming a kind of natural moat. There would be no hunting. Once the doors of the clubhouse closed, the cover story stayed outside with the salt air. For 9 straight days, according to the Federal Reserve's own history, they worked inside that building. The schedule was brutal. 20 hours at the table, 4 on a bed, then back again. Coffee cups multiplied, ashtrays filled and overflowed. One participant would later remember the room as filled with the smoke of hundreds of cigars. The tension was unbelievable. Voices stayed low. Men leaned forward over papers, over each other's sentences, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile line of thought they were trying to hold. They were not just drafting a banking bill. In that sealed room, they were trying to redirect a current that ran through every farm, factory, and small-town bank in the country, without raising a visible wave on the surface. Their most dangerous problem wasn't a missing financial formula, but it was the public itself. In the American mind, the phrase central bank carried the stench of foreign crowns and Wall Street operators tightening credit from far away. That label alone could sink any proposal before a single clause was read. If what they built looked or sounded like the old European models, it would die in Congress and in the streets. This is where Paul Warburg, the German banker in the room, stepped toward the chalkboard. He had lived with central banks. He knew how they were supposed to look. Now he had to design one that wouldn't look like itself. Chalk scraped against slate as he drew a rough box and wrote a name at the top, then crossed it out. Around the table, chairs creaked. The others watched the board like men reading a set of tide charts that would decide whether their ships made harbor or broke on a reef. He started with the obvious problem. If they called it a central bank, it was finished. So he wrote something else. According to the Federal Reserve's own history, the plan taking shape on that board would be introduced as a centralizing reserve agency. A mouthful, and deliberately dull, the kind of phrase that could drift past a suspicious public. One of the older bankers pushed back. If the thing was openly private, voters would see it as a Wall Street machine and kill it. If it was genuinely public, they would lose control of the helm they had come here to protect. Warburg answered with structure. He drew a line down the board, splitting the box in two. On one side, he sketched a small council in Washington, a body that could be presented as governmental, serving the public interest. On the other, he began to dot the slate with circles, each one labeled as a regional reserve bank somewhere out in the country. Local boards, local names, a lattice of apparent decentralization. From a distance, it would look scattered, like a chain of small harbors, each run by its own town. Underneath, as he explained, the ownership and real control would remain in private hands, the same hands holding cigars around that table, tied together by the rules they were drafting here. There were arguments over the details, how openly the regional pieces would be linked back to Washington, how visible the private influence should be, how much authority the board in the capital ought to appear to have. Some wanted stronger language, a bolder claim of private rights. Others warned that any sign of overt dominance would draw fire the moment the plan surfaced. Warburg kept returning to the chalkboard, erasing, redrawing connections, adjusting the balance between what would appear public and what would remain firmly, quietly, private. The creature they were shaping on that slate would wear the face of a public utility, but its vital organs would answer to the banks. At some point, after another round of revisions, the talk thinned out. Papers stopped shuffling. For the first time in days, the lines on the board seemed to hold. The agency had a name that did not trigger old fears. It had regional branches that would convince towns and cities they had a say. And at its center, beneath the public language, it preserved the private control the men on Jekyll Island had come to safeguard. In that room, in that hour, the design on the board finally looked stable. The thing built in the dark now sketched clearly enough to face the light of public debate. Then, from the porch, a sound cut through the muffled quiet, the sharp crack of a heavy footstep on dry wooden boards. Not the soft creak of the house settling, not the wind off the water. A single deliberate stride. It wasn't one of them. They were all inside, every single one. Silence fell in the room, a heavy, immediate stillness, thicker than the cigar smoke. The men who had been debating the fate of a nation's economy were frozen, their eyes locked on the door to the porch. It wasn't one of them. They were all inside. Then, the collective mask of composure cracked. Panic, cold and electric, flashed across their faces. You could almost see the same calculation run through each mind. A stranger. An unvetted outsider on this island. At this moment. If that person saw Senator Nelson Aldrich sitting here with the heads of the nation's most powerful banks, it was over. Years of clandestine work, the 9 days of intense, mind-breaking negotiation. All of it would evaporate in a single headline. There was no debate, no discussion. They acted with the chilling efficiency of a predator protecting its nest. 2 of the younger men in the group detached from the circle, slipping out a side door into the coastal darkness. The whispers were hushed, but absolute. The threat had to be neutralized. Minutes later, the stranger, a local who had simply wandered onto the property, was intercepted. He was firmly and quietly escorted back to the mainland. The breach was sealed, but the incident left a permanent scar. It reinforced the immense risk they were taking, hardening their paranoia into something cold and permanent. On the 9th day, their work was finally done. The manuscript, the blueprint for the creature they had built in the dark, lay finished on the great oak table. And in that room, heavy with stale smoke and exhaustion, they made one final agreement. They took a solemn vow. They swore to one another, looking each man in the eye, that they would never speak of what happened on Jekyll Island. If ever asked, they would deny they were ever there. Years later, one of them, Frank Vanderlip, would confess the feeling of that moment in his autobiography. He wrote, "I was as secretive, indeed, as furtive as any conspirator." The plan was now sealed. A hidden current, engineered in total secrecy, was ready to be unleashed into the vast, unsuspecting ocean of American life. The only question left: would this secret current actually change the tide of history? Or would it die right here, a ghost in a locked room on a forgotten island? The current didn't die. It simply waited, moving silently beneath the surface of American politics for 3 years, a quiet, patient, relentless pressure. Then the moment arrived. It was December 23rd, 1923. Across the country, Christmas lights were flickering. Families were gathering around tables. The air felt like a nation exhaling into its most sacred holiday. In Washington, D.C., inside the Capitol, the contrast was stark. a near-empty Senate chamber under dim winter light. Rows of dark desks standing vacant, while a thin scattering of senators shuffled papers in the hush. Official records show that many members had already left for the Christmas recess. The floor was half deserted, and that absence was its own kind of opportunity. In that quiet, with almost no one watching, the Federal Reserve Act was brought forward. With ruthless precision, the bill was rushed to the floor. The vote was quick, 43 to 25. Within hours, President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. The creature from Jekyll Island had surfaced. It now had an official name, the Federal Reserve System. In the decades that followed, mention a private meeting on Jekyll Island in respectable company, and you could feel the temperature drop. An eye roll, a polite deflection. Your name quietly filed under crank or conspiracy theorist. In history texts and banker memoirs, the Fed's creation appeared as an orderly reform born from open debate. The private train, the fake hunting trip, the locked-door negotiations were reduced to rumor, if they appeared at all. Official history hardened. The deeper story slipped beneath it. The vow of silence held. Truth has a patient gravity. 22 years later, it pulled something to the surface. In the February 9th, 1935 issue of one of America's most popular magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, a confession appeared. The piece was titled, "From Farm Boy to Financier." The author was an aging Frank Vanderlip, one of the original 7 from Jekyll Island. Not a critic on the outside, but a man who had ridden that train and helped draft the bill that became the Federal Reserve Act. He didn't just talk. He boasted. He laid out the deception, the secret train trip, the fake hunting story, the absolute secrecy. In his own words, the group had been as secretive, indeed, as furtive as any conspirator. There it was. Every element the cranks had whispered about for years, printed as proud war stories in his own article. The same details that would once get you laughed out of a polite conversation were now sitting on coffee tables across the country. The ghost in the locked room had finally spoken, and he was confirming the floor plan. To this day, if you visit the clubhouse on Jekyll Island, there is a small plaque on the wall. It reads, "In this room, the Federal Reserve System was created." The island doesn't deny it. Neither did Vanderlip. Together, they mark the moment when the monetary bloodstream of the United States was quietly rerouted through a design drawn up offstage by a handful of men. The creature was real, and it had been unleashed. Its deeper appetite would not show itself right away. For almost a century, it waited in the background, adjusting credit while most people lived on the bright surface. It waited for the year 2008, the year it would rise into view and claim its first public sacrifice. And for almost a century, that creature born in the dark on Jekyll Island lay dormant, its mechanisms working invisibly beneath the currents of the economy. Until the fall of 2008, September 15th. The trading floors of Lehman Brothers are dead quiet. This is a space built for noise, for shouting, for the raw energy of billions of dollars changing hands every second. But today, the only sound is the soft rustle of cardboard boxes being filled. Employees drift through the hallways like ghosts, some crying silently, packing up the remnants of their lives. And in the center of the storm's eye, CEO Dick Fuld stands watching it all evaporate. A man nicknamed the Gorilla for his aggressive, chest-thumping dominance of Wall Street. A man who for decades moved markets with a single phone call. Today, he is powerless. He's watching the 4th largest investment bank in America, a 158-year-old institution, file for the largest bankruptcy in the history of the country. But what you're seeing on his face isn't just loss. It's a deep, profound, almost religious confusion. Because his entire worldview, the core belief that powered his every action, was that this was impossible. He was a member of the club. Lehman was too big to fail. His mind kept replaying the evidence. Just 6 months earlier, in March, a smaller firm, Bear Stearns, had been on the brink. And the Federal Reserve, the creature, had stepped in. It had engineered a bailout, a rescue. It had reinforced the one sacred rule. The safety net is always there for the most powerful players. But Fuld was failing to understand the real rules. The safety net he believed in. It wasn't there to catch him. It had been deliberately, precisely pulled away. He was being made an example of, an offering. Even in that moment, though, watching his legacy turn to ash, one single unshakable thought echoed in his mind. They have to save us. I'm one of them. I'm in the club. But the club had already locked the door. In the final, desperate days of September 2008, what is now known as the Lehman Weekend, the heads of Wall Street were summoned. Not to a celebratory dinner, but to the New York Federal Reserve on Liberty Street, a stone fortress sunk into the financial district like a bunker on the seabed. The order was simple and brutal. Find a private solution to the Lehman problem. Patch the breach. Keep the systems whole from ripping open. For the men in that room, it was a meeting to save their world. For Dick Fuld, it was the quiet beginning of his own funeral. He wasn't allowed in the main room, while his competitors, men he'd known for decades, argued over the fate of his 158-year-old firm. The CEO was told to wait outside. Eyewitness accounts from that weekend placed him in the lobby, parked under the Fed seal, a ghost haunting the edges of his own demise. From there, the conference room door became a porthole. He could see shadows moving, hear the low rumble of familiar voices. Peers speaking a language he was no longer invited to translate. Each time the door opened a crack, he'd glance up, expecting to be called in, only to watch another banker stride past without meeting his eyes. The polished floor threw back his reflection, not as the gorilla, but as a man in someone else's lobby, checking a phone that wasn't ringing, realizing that the club he thought he belonged to was now meeting without him. As the hours bled away, something shifted in the currents. Phones lit up. Calls began bouncing between New York and London. Out of the fog, one last shape took form. Barclays, the British bank. Where others saw only wreckage and contagion, Barclays' team saw pieces they could still salvage. A deal outline snapped into place. Lehman would be taken over. The worst assets pushed aside. The rest folded into a stronger hull. Draft agreements were marked up on both sides of the Atlantic. Numbers adjusted, clauses traded. The timing was razor tight. Lock this before markets opened again, and the field of debris started moving. For a few tense hours, it felt like a narrow channel had opened. Not safe water, but passable. Dawn comes earlier in London than in New York, and with it came the reversal. The UK's Financial Services Authority, the regulator overseeing Barclays, refused to approve the rescue. They would not let a British bank swallow Lehman whole over a single weekend, saying they would not import America's cancer. Whatever the justification, the effect was simple and final. The only serious private sector lifeline was cut. Later investigations would describe that call as the nail in Lehman's coffin, the moment the last viable salvage operation was ordered to stand down. By then, the message was clear. If Barclays was out, no other Wall Street bank was stepping in. One by one, the private exits had been sealed, the side hatches dogged shut, until only a single route remained. Public money. Washington, a government bailout brokered by the same Federal Reserve whose lobby Fuld was pacing. To him, that still sounded like a lifeline, the lender of last resort, the emergency floodgate to stop the system from imploding and take Lehman with it. But the structure of that gate was something else. It could be opened for some institutions and kept shut for others. With every private path choked off, Fuld was being pushed toward that last door. Not back into the club he thought he belonged to, but into the machinery in Washington that could decide which firm would float and which would be left to sink. He walked toward it, believing it would save him, not yet understanding that for Lehman Brothers, that government bailout wasn't a lifeline at all. It was the kill switch. The switch was a simple, legalistic word. No. In the final hours of that September weekend, as emergency meetings dragged between Wall Street and Washington, Dick Fuld made his last appeal to Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and Fed Chair Ben Bernanke. He asked for the same kind of emergency loan that had kept Bear Stearns afloat just months earlier, a temporary bridge from the Federal Reserve, backed by Lehman's assets. One more lifeline before the water closed over. The reply was clipped and technical. Paulson, a man who knew Wall Street's inner machinery as well as anyone, said the government had no legal authority to save Lehman. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission would later echo that justification. Lehman's collateral was too weak, the statutes too rigid, the rules. With that, Lehman was pushed to the edge. On September 15, 2008, it filed for bankruptcy. In the hours that followed, firms around the world scrambled to trace their exposure. Markets lurched, funding channels tightened, and institutions began to pull back from one another, unsure who might be dragged under next. The failure sent a shockwave through the global financial system. The kill switch had been flipped. Less than 24 hours after that refusal, the posture changed. On day one, the official line was, "No legal authority." On day two, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury announced they would extend an $85 billion loan to the insurance giant AIG. A lifeline of $85 billion in public support for a company far larger than Lehman and deeply entangled across the global financial system. For Lehman, the law had been presented as a stone wall. For AIG, barely a day later, it turned out to be a door that could be quietly unlocked. After the panic, congressional hearings and reports picked through the wreckage of that decision. They documented that AIG's single largest trading partner was Goldman Sachs, the Wall Street firm where Hank Paulson had served as CEO from 1999 to 2006. That $85 billion did not stop inside AIG. It flowed through, like rescue funds pumped into a damaged hull, to pay off AIG's counterparties in full. More than $12.9 billion of the initial bailout money went directly to Goldman Sachs, settling its bets at 100 cents on the dollar. Looked at in sequence, a pattern starts to take shape. Lehman is allowed to go under, its collapse triggering the broader storm. AIG is kept alive just long enough to serve as a payment channel. And among the firms made whole, Paulson's old shop, Goldman Sachs, stands near the front of the line. To many who follow the money trail, it feels less like random chaos and more like choreography. Lehman as the sacrifice, AIG as the conduit, Goldman as one of the prizes. On the surface, it reads like crisis management. Underneath, it shows a system that can let one institution drown while quietly building a bridge for another, depending on who is standing on the deck. The system was designed in private on that fog-shrouded island in 1910. In 2008, its rules were rewritten in full view of the cameras. Which moment unsettles you more? The secret meeting or the public double standard? Let me know in the comments. In the way Lehman was abandoned and AIG was preserved, you can see the outline of the creature built in the dark. A structure that doesn't just protect its own, but is willing to risk the wider world to keep the inner circle whole. To understand why that isn't a flaw, but an intended function, we have to go back to the blueprint, back to that foggy island in 1910, where the first lines of this design were drawn. And so, we arrive at the grand design. That chaos in 2008. That was not the system breaking. The system, folks, wasn't broken at all. It was working exactly the way Frank Vanderlip and his friends designed it to work, on that quiet, fog-covered island in 1910. A central bank shaped in private, by and for the biggest interests. A mechanism built to cushion their falls, to turn their risks into our emergencies. In 2008, you watched that blueprint surface. Losses sank households and towns, while rescue lines were thrown to the very institutions that had torn the hull. This is the source, the origin point of that quiet, existential unease that so many of us feel. The deep-seated feeling that the game is rigged. We live inside an engineered reality, a world where the rules are opaque and can be changed at will by an unseen hand above the waves. That environment generates what we will call an oceanic pressure, a chronic societal anxiety that presses down on all of us. On screen, you could write it like this: Oceanic pressure. The constant psychological weight produced when you leave in a system whose financial rules are hidden, adjustable from above, and enforced unevenly. Once you see the pattern, the weight makes sense. Jekyll Island gave us a structure where private actors set the currents. 2008 showed those currents in action. Ordinary people were left to flood, while the architects were quietly lifted to safety. When you understand that this is not a malfunction, but the design, every headline about unexpected crises becomes another reminder that you are not steering the vessel. And here, we pause. I need you to feel the weight of this. That oceanic pressure is not just a poetic image. It is an instrument, a carefully calibrated background force. If you don't recognize how it operates, you can go years misreading the currents of unease in your own life, thinking the problem is only personal weakness instead of the water you are standing in. This pressure is not just a feeling. It is a measurable force. For decades, large-scale economic and psychological studies have tracked what happens when inequality widens and financial insecurity rises. The pattern is consistent. As people face more housing instability, job loss, debt, and sudden financial shocks, measured rates of depression and anxiety climb across the population. You can see it in national health surveys, where more and more people list money as their main source of stress after major crashes. You can see it in the growing numbers of diagnosed anxiety and mood disorders following financial upheavals. In other words, the unease is not a private hallucination. It is a rational response to an environment designed to be unstable for most and stabilized only for a few. That is oceanic pressure translated into data. Over decades, this constant low-grade pressure has carved out a chasm in our world. We can call it the trust vacuum. On screen, you could define it like this: trust vacuum. The hollow left behind when repeated, system-shaped crises teach people that the institutions above them will protect themselves first and the public last. Here is the bridge between the two. When you watch the same pattern play out, speculation, crisis, rescue for the largest players, fallout for everyone else, the pressure doesn't just sit in your chest. It starts to rearrange your expectations. You begin to assume that official promises are temporary, that safeguards are flexible for those with the right connections and rigid for everyone else. Each bailout, each quiet backroom fix, each foreclosed home and vanished job is another signal. The rules of the surface are not the rules of the depths. Over time, that accumulation erodes trust. Not in a sudden collapse, but like slow leakage from a damaged hull. Since the late 1950s, long-running public opinion surveys by organizations such as Gallup and Pew have been asking people a simple question: how much do you trust major institutions, banks, the federal government, to do the right thing? In the early decades of that record, large portions of the public said they trusted them. After repeated crises, and especially after 2008, those numbers fell into a trench and have stayed near the bottom. Trust did not bounce back with the markets. The vacuum remained. That is the trust vacuum in action. A wide, quiet gap between the power these institutions hold over daily life and the confidence people have that they will use it fairly. A space where faith used to be, now filled with wary calculation and tired resignation. Most of us can feel this without ever seeing a chart. We sense the double currents. One current that sweeps ordinary people toward the rocks when something goes wrong, and another, hidden undercurrent that carries a select few safely past the storm. We see the distant lights on the surface ships, their decks crowded with familiar names, while we tread water in the dark below. It's because we sense the hypocrisy. We sense, dimly, the presence of that private club on the upper decks. We know we are watching it from the cold side of the glass. And that, folks, is the final, simple truth. As the late observer George Carlin once stated with cold clarity, it's a big club, and you ain't in it. Your unease in this water is not paranoia. It is a sane reaction to an insane system, one that was drawn up on a secluded island and revealed itself in full during the crash of 2008. Oceanic pressure, the trust vacuum. These are names for the forces you have been feeling all along. If you believe in understanding the hidden currents that shape our world, subscribe for more deep dives. And never forget to question the official story.